Now, welcome back. There's been a huge outcry following President Cyril Ramaphosa's announcement of the government's intention to set up an independent inquiry regarding a Russian vessel named Lady R that docked in Simonstown in December last year. Now, the public has been asking how the government is still in the dark 6 months on after that incident was reported. Now, U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Brigetti, made damning allegations when he told the media in Pretoria last week that South Africa sent arms to Russia. Meanwhile, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation said on Friday it was going to take political steps to reprimand Brigetti for his utterances. So to help us navigate and perhaps better understand what all of this means, we are joined by Professor Chris Landsberg, who's chair of the African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, director of the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership. Prof, good morning. Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
It's been a minute, but we are so grateful to see you.
Thank you.
So all of this, I almost want to say the shenanigans that played out last week. What was your take on just exactly how that particular impasse spilled over into the public domain?
It was calculated by the U.S. I don't think it was a mistake on the part of the U.S. ambassador or an error. Remember that statement, which very fascinatingly, Sakina, coincided with our president starting to speak in Parliament. Just look at the choreography of this whole thing. I mean, it was so meticulously orchestrated. It came in the wake of visits to Washington by South African envoys, where this matter was discussed, and we are told, and that's now the dominant language in all the statements, the relationship is strategic, it's back on track, and so on. But nobody, and the United States certainly, not Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, not the President, and certainly not the Ambassador, has retracted their statement that they made a mistake in the serious allegation. That was calculated, and I suppose for a number of reasons. If we want to give them the benefit of the doubt, as John Stremlau would say, they became so frustrated, they didn't get an answer. It's been almost 6 months since January when this happened. What's going on? But why would you so boldly go and expose this, right? They either know something that government also knows and pretends it's not aware of, but there are some serious motives behind it. It's an attempt to delegitimize South Africa as this neutral, moral voice in the world, neutral player, non-aligned. For too long, South Africa has gotten away with, we are a democracy, we get invited to all the Western clubs and so on, but we always also play in the BRICS domain and stuff. And there was nothing wrong with that. There was a time when South Africa was very sophisticated in managing strategically, doing brilliant eggshell dancing at times, but well orchestrated, calibrated diplomacy during the Mbeki years and so on. And that actually grew in our, helped our legitimacy to grow. Here is the real issue. If it is true that South Africa did sell weapons, or weapons made its way from South Africa to Russia, the ramifications are serious. The implications are serious for us as all. It means, just to conclude, so we can get into some other issues, that we've effectively become a player in this war, and no longer can we go around parading as this neutral voice of reason, mediator, interested in resolving conflicts. The consequences are serious.
So, as you say, this seemed to have been well orchestrated by the U.S. envoy to South Africa. But this is not the first time that Ambassador Brigetti has ruffled the feathers of Pretoria. You would remember there was
the terrorism.
Yes, the terrorism notice that was issued. And that you thought, okay, that seemed rather strange. It was bizarre because, again, you would have thought that there are diplomatic channels to follow in how South Africa and Washington would communicate with each other around some of these issues.
Before I make that point, because I want to forget to make this point that I really want to get out there, because maybe that's the only thing people might remember. I've been struck by how even amongst the commentariat, the so-called analysts, there are these divisions and almost factional lines. There's a pro-America group that goes on and they are bold and make their case. Then there are the pro-Chinese analysts. Then there are the pro-Russian analysts. And we need a bit of nuance, to come into this to this thing. I tell you what is important about your question. Even after all the statements made this weekend that things are on track, if you look at the spat that's going on between, now both of them will, I suppose, take me to task for calling it a spat. But if you look at the ambassador's continuing utterances versus, for example, Obed Bapele, there's still some friction there. This thing is by no means over. But your point, why go public on the terrorism thing, etc.? The American ambassador made a very important point during the course of the last weekend. Now, I'm not here to, say whether he's right or wrong. I'm interpreting what I see. That's where I come from in terms of analysis. He uttered the words, and I quote for you, "The ANC has been very hostile towards America." Here is the contradiction and irony about South Africa's foreign policy. We are told that the central priorities of our foreign policy is to overcome the triple helix of poverty, unemployment, joblessness, to uplift our society. Then you get the list of strategic players that can help us to overcome these challenges. United States is top of the list, Germany, France, European Union, because these are strong economies in the world, right? So every state has economic goals and interests and therefore partners, and every state has political interests and partners. What seemed to have happened to the ANC, and I'm now suggesting this to the ANC, the problem is, you take any of the discussion documents of the last 15 years, before the last three elections, Nasrec, you take 2017 and so on. These documents are so littered with strong anti-American, pro-imperialist language, which I happen to agree America is an imperialist power. It's a dictatorship abroad. It carries around with a big stick telling everybody else to do. I don't have a problem with that analysis. But when it comes to analyses on Russia and China, not only is there very little that we do in terms of what are the implications of their conduct, for example, in Africa, mercenarism by Russia, the role of mercenaries, China's resource extraction. There's not much analysis on those powers. In fact, in 2017 we decided, in 2015 we decided we're going to almost act like the spokespersons for Russia and China by in that document saying, and we will not stand idly by if America declares a war on them. So politically, we side so openly with those two, and economically, the ones that's supposed to help us economically, we barrage them. I'm not saying don't. What I'm saying, bring a bit of sophisticated nuance in. Let me put it this way for you shortly. If you know what you want in foreign policy, and you know who can give you what, then behave in manners. Then you can get that, rather than going around creating alienation and things like this that flies in the face of what you're seeking to achieve.
So you mentioned earlier that during the Mbeki administration, for example, that South Africa was perhaps a lot more adept at, being more nuanced, as you say, and sophisticated in how we handled our foreign policy relations. But right now, what is South Africa's foreign policy position with regard to what is going on in the world at the moment, our relationships with the United States, with Russia, with China, as you say? Because many people were scathing of Ambassador Brigety last week, saying that he's conflating party and state in speaking to ANC policy and, bemoaning the fact that the ANC seems to be hostile, whereas that has nothing to do with what is necessarily going on in the South African state. Do you agree with that?
Well, and you know what's interesting? I don't even have to look for a lot of evidence. Just in terms of, as you say, if there's one thing that Brigety achieved, he unleashed a flurry of reaction, and there's this hurly-burly going on, and even I'm now back talking about this, so he achieved his objective. Okay, so they take umbrage at what Brigety is saying, and yet, how did we react this weekend? For the first time, the president goes to a meeting in Durban to talk to the ANC about internal shenanigans within the movement there, and he spends 3/4 talking about a foreign policy matter. The president calls President Zelensky. He calls President Biden. He calls President Putin. He calls. So all of a sudden, the non-alignment that they seem to have been professing, this thing triggered them into doing just that. But not only is the president speaking about it, Obed Mapela from the ANC goes around and he speaks. Then the advisor on state security, they were supposed to go and sort out the mess after the security intelligence issues we had. Sidney Mfumari, I learned, is now the envoy. He speaks a lot. So just as they accuse him of conflating party and state, I suppose he could turn back and say, now if everybody who spoke this weekend, who should we listen to? But let's not forget about whether it's the Americans that should say us. I liked your interview with Araj Abedian this morning, because there's a point that I want to make from a foreign policy perspective that is directly in line with what Araj Abedian said. And then Leanne quoted President Mbeki. What is going on here at the crux of this thing is after the storm goes and settle on this thing, DIRCO must go back and government must go back and do serious introspection about where is the professionalism, the epicenter, the planning, the strategic thinking about our position in the world. Who speaks when about what and so on. There seems to be a free fall in government that's going on, a laissez-faire, which means anybody can say anything, from foreign affairs to domestic issues to economic policies and so on. And I was struck by how what they said, you can also now take to the foreign policy domain. All our officials, including the Director General, spend so much time abroad, listen carefully, Sakina, doing damage control. And I ask one question. While all these senior people in foreign policy and diplomacy and our diplomatic corps are doing all of these things, who's actually building the department? Who's building a coterie of strong analytical thinking, strategic envoys, diplomats that can deal with matters like this? But there seemed to be a running of rabbits and so on. So I just wanted to also bring that perspective in.
So when all is said and done, if we look at South Africa's position as non-aligned for the most part, or at least this is what we are told, do you think that we are in any way, shape or form doing justice to what we say our position is? Do you think we are being bullied by all and sundry bullied by the United States, bullied by Russia, bullied by everybody, because seemingly we don't quite know, or perhaps are not strong enough in coming out definitively and stating our position, and people actually believing that this is who we say we are. In other words, not contradicting ourselves by saying one thing and doing another.
Sure. I would use a different phrase to bullying. I think even the external players are perceiving a weakness. They're perceiving vacuums in this once proud, well-organized country with a proud standing in the world. It's almost that they're seeing what, excuse me for the word, what the Polokwanization of our state has done, even to its foreign policy. So everybody's exploiting it. Now, if you think this was a tirade against the Americans, look what President Putin does while we focus on Ambassador Bikati. Just weekend, he releases gory details of a telephone call between him and President Ramaphosa on Friday. We had a fantastic conversation, my friend Cyril and I. We've decided we are strong allies. We're going to work in the economic, military sphere. So the Americans, they are concerned about the relationship. The Russians reinforce it. We don't say anything about the Kremlin, also now speaking out of turn. The Kremlin almost does a Bikati, but we don't say anything about the Kremlin. But yesterday was a real masterstroke. What does President Putin do yesterday? He announces the date for the Africa-Russia summit a month before BRICS. What did he just do? President Ramaphosa, my BRICS friend, I'm inviting you to Moscow. Come in July. And I'm looking forward to seeing you back in South Africa for the BRICS summit. He's laid down the gauntlet on this thing of whether he will and will not be invited. So to answer your question, it's not even bullying. It's people are playing us. It's almost like a puppet. Everybody's becoming a puppet master that does with us what we want. And
because we are weak.
Because we are weak, and also, Sakina, because we get invited to the G summit by Boris Yeltsin and the German Chancellor Schulz, and then what does the Japanese do next? They disinvite us. We're at the G20, and it's almost like we now enjoy the limelight rather than going with strategic agendas to these things and play itself. But if you think we're negative on this interview, I think it could be selfish. But there's just one hope that I think the ANC should pray for, that there were no arms sales. Because if it is found that South Africa wasn't really at fault there, then, and I think this thing shook them to the point that they are going to do it, they can rescue this role, reputation, as the honest broker, as the non-aligned. You ended with, on the question of leadership, with Iraja Bidion. Let me now also make my comment, and again, I agree. And I want to use this phrase. Our president seemed to have developed this knack for, and it tends to get him into trouble, government by commission, government by committee. Every time he finds himself in a corner on an issue, instead of being decisive, what the president could have done there, when John Steenhuisen, who's so bullish, bullish and concerned about blackouts, what does he do? He takes the opportunity to go and drop a foreign policy bombshell, catch the president completely off guard, and it's clear that John was briefed. Man, he had information and intel that and he was going to use it. And there's almost this inflexive, reactive thing by the president. Every time I'm in a corner, I go for a commission. Here's the consequences might not be nice, because there are two implications here. You can write the terms of reference for a commission as tightly as you wish, Sakina. Just go see whether Prof. Landsberg and Prof. Manas and Prof. Sakina, they have a closer relationship than they pretend to. Other stuff will come out. And the risk that that commission will expose is broader South Africa-Russia relations that doesn't only address the issue of arms, but party-to-party relations, money issues, and so on. So why they went for that? And then they agree with the Americans during the demarche on Friday, the minister, Friday or Thursday. Now, there I was shocked. I was shocked when I read that. Clayson Moniela boldly, in confidence, releases this statement. We've now agreed. We're going to wait for the outcome. We're going to work with the Americans on this thing. And then comes the statement. And the two intelligence services will work together on this thing. Which respectful country outsources its intelligence services, not just to any country, but to the Americans at all? So question, Mr. President, who is really advising you? And what kind of strategic advice are you getting?
And who's in charge of this country? Professor Chris Landsberg, we could go on and on. So good to have you back, Professor Chris Landsberg, and speaking to us about some of the latest developments in the country. And he is, of course, chairperson of the African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy at the University of Johannesburg, among others, and discussing the saga engulfing South Africa about that unannounced Russian docking and what subsequently followed from that.